Welcome back to Vietnamese Case Files. In today's video, we will revisit 6 horrifying case files where the closest relationships became the source of unimaginable tragedies. We'll begin with the murders of dentists Spencer and Monique Tepe in Ohio, where the truth behind the killer was a bitter ex-husband who had held on to resentment for 8 years, sending chills through investigators. Next is a terrifying secret hidden for an entire decade in El Monte, where John Taylor Huynh killed his own mother and buried her body right in the backyard. The brutality continues with David Huynh, who used plastic wrap to take his mother's life and then attempted to destroy the scene with gas in order to cover up the crime. The video also dives into a case in Seattle, where Si Fu took his niece's life over a conflict sparked by a new pair of shoes. Even more heartbreaking is the story of Lum Luing, a father who cruelly threw his 4 young children into the sea from the Dauphin Island Bridge in a fit of rage toward his wife. Finally, we examine the case of Philippe Dinh, a police officer in Las Vegas who turned his home into hell through brutal abuse of his wife, who was also his colleague in law enforcement. Join us as we break down every clue and motive behind these cases and draw painful lessons about staying vigilant and protecting yourself, starting right now. And if you enjoy investigative true crime content and want to follow along with Vietnamese Case Files in upcoming cases, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss a single episode. Now, let's begin. On Sunday afternoon, December 6th, 2015, a sharp gunshot suddenly rang out, shattering the peaceful atmosphere inside a family home in the Columbia City area. Hearing the noise, relatives rushed upstairs in panic and were horrified to find the daughter, Christy, collapsed on the bed, with blood pouring from her neck. The scene was utter chaos. The girl lay motionless, and beside her was a 16-year-old cousin in total panic. In shock, the family immediately called 911 for help. When paramedics and police arrived, they found the entire family kneeling beside Christy in despair. Christy was rushed to Harborview Medical Center, but the injury was too severe and she did not survive. From the very beginning, the family provided police with a lead about the shooter, Christy's uncle named Si Fu. Witnesses at the scene all confirmed that they saw him holding a gun and leaving the house right after the shot. The suspicion was further reinforced by a haunting phone call that took place afterward. While cooperating with police, Christy's father called Si Fu, and on the other end, the suspect casually admitted, "You know, I shot your daughter already, don't you?" and then immediately hung up. Those chilling words echoed as the father froze, realizing that his wife's own younger brother had taken his daughter's life. The shock was overwhelming, not only for the family, but for the entire community as well, because the person behind the tragedy was the victim's own blood relative. The house was immediately sealed off for the investigation, while police urgently launched a search for the suspect. Inside Christy's bedroom, the remaining signs indicated that a violent struggle had taken place. The bedroom door had been kicked hard enough to break the lock, and behind it, a heavy wooden dresser had been shoved into place to block the door from the inside. These details showed the desperate attempt by the victim and her cousin to barricade themselves against the attacker's aggression. On the bed, partially folded clothes were still scattered about, suggesting the 2 girls were attacked suddenly in the middle of an ordinary moment at home. At the scene, police recovered a shell casing and evidence indicating the victim was shot from very close range. After gathering key evidence, authorities conducted a preliminary reconstruction of the scene. According to that reconstruction, Christy was shot once in the neck while she was on the bed. The close-range shot caused exceptionally severe damage, leaving the girl nearly dead at the scene. Alongside the crime scene examination, the victim's identity and her relationship to the suspect were gradually clarified in order to uncover a motive. According to relatives, the victim was Christy Nguyen Phu, 14 years old, a well-behaved student at Chief Sealth International, and an only child who was always surrounded by love and high expectations from her family. Before the heartbreaking incident, Christy's relationship with her uncle, Si Fu, had not involved any serious conflict. However, some information indicated that Si Fu was unemployed and in desperate need of money. He had asked Christy to hand over her new shoes so he could sell them for spending money. Perhaps because the shoes were a meaningful gift from her father, Christy refused. That refusal is believed to have sparked a simmering conflict that later erupted beyond anyone's control. Immediately after taking the case, based on clear leads, Seattle police issued a citywide warrant for Si Fu. Investigators checked locations where he might hide, and they also examined call and message histories in detail on the phones of both the suspect and the victim. The findings further reinforced the suspected motive. On Christie's phone, police discovered a series of threatening messages sent by Sifu himself. The messages contained brutal language, warning that he would take her life if she refused to hand over the shoes. This was especially crucial evidence, showing that the killing had been preceded by threats and planning, completely ruling out the possibility of an accident or a sudden, random outburst. After 2 tense days, the manhunt finally produced results. Sifu was arrested on the morning of December 8, 2015, while hiding in a house in the Skyway area on the outskirts of Seattle. He was taken into custody without any resistance, perhaps because he understood there was no way out once the entire city knew about the horrific crime. At the police station, investigators began the interrogation. At first, Sifu tried to evade responsibility. Although he admitted he was very angry with Christie and said he felt remorse, he still denied direct culpability. He told investigators that he had initially only intended to hit his niece, as if pulling the trigger was an unintended accident. However, that claim seriously conflicted with the physical evidence, from the threatening messages to the close-range shot to the victim's neck. Investigators did not take long to dismantle Sifu's weak defense. Faced with undeniable evidence and firm pressure from police, he ultimately lowered his head and confessed. With substantial evidence in hand, the King County Prosecutor's Office charged Sifu with first-degree murder with premeditation, along with a firearm enhancement and unlawful possession of a weapon, because Sifu had previously been prohibited from owning a gun. The judge at the initial hearing found there was sufficient basis to proceed and signed a detention order with bail set at $2 million USD, an extremely high figure reflecting the exceptional severity of the case. From there, the legal battle officially began, focusing on uncovering the true motive behind Sifu's act. Did he kill his niece solely over a pair of shoes, or were there deeper personal resentments or psychological instability involved? Police and prosecutors worked to collect every possible clue to answer that question, while also preparing carefully for the court proceedings ahead. According to the investigation, Sifu, 24 years old, was a Vietnamese-American young man who grew up in Seattle. Before the crime, he frequently came and went and stayed at the home of his older sister's family, Christie's mother. Sifu's circumstances were complicated. He had no steady job and had repeatedly come into conflict with the law for harassment and making threats against others. In May 2015, just 7 months before the tragedy, Sifu had been convicted in a domestic violence case. He sent multiple threatening messages about attacking his ex-girlfriend and her child, leading the court to strip him of his right to possess firearms. However, Sifu appeared to have completely disregarded the law, secretly carrying a weapon while living with Christie's family. People who knew him described Sifu as hot-tempered, controlling, and frequently resentful about money. He often showed irritation when he saw his niece owning expensive items while he himself was constantly broke and in debt. That jealousy was most clearly exposed in the story about the shoes, when Sifu believed he had the right to take his niece's new pair to sell for cash, and that she was obligated to give in to him. He repeatedly demanded that Christie hand over the shoes, but she flatly refused because they were a meaningful gift from her father. That rejection struck at Sifu's pride and set off his rage. He sent a series of threatening messages to his niece, warning that if she did not give him the shoes, he would hurt her, showing that the intent to use violence had been brewing beforehand. On the afternoon of December 6, 2015, Sifu decided to go to the house in person to pressure his niece. He brought a handgun and went straight into Christie's room. At that moment, Christie and her 16-year-old cousin were folding clothes inside. Sifu stormed in and began yelling, demanding that Christie hand over the new shoes her father had just bought for her. Although terrified, Christie still firmly said no to her uncle's unjustified anger. That final refusal pushed Sifu's fury to its peak, and he immediately pointed the gun and threatened the victim on the spot. Overwhelmed with fear, Christie reluctantly grabbed an old pair of shoes and handed them to him, hoping he would calm down. But when he realized they were not what he wanted, Sifu became even more unhinged. The two girls screamed and ran into the bedroom, locking the door, and tried to shove a wooden dresser against it. Outside, Sifu kept shouting for them to open up. Faced with their resistance, his rage reached a breaking point. Without hesitation, Sifu stepped back, charged forward, and kicked hard, blasting the door open and knocking the heavy dresser aside. In an instant, he rushed into the room with the gun in his hand and a vicious expression on his face. The two girls shrank back on the bed in sheer terror. Sifu walked straight to the bed, aimed the muzzle at his niece's neck, and hissed cruel words. A split second later, a deafening shot rang out. The bullet struck Christy directly in the neck from close range, and she nearly collapsed on the spot. As her cousin screamed in horror, Sifu paused for a few seconds, stared at his niece, then turned and fled the room. He ran down the stairs and quickly disappeared from the scene. The entire Ghutna unfolded in just a few minutes, but the consequences were beyond repair. After leaving the house, Sifu immediately got into a car and fled. He drove to a house in the Skyway area, possibly belonging to friends or distant relatives, and hid there for 2 days. However, the Seattle Police Department's dragnet tightened by the hour. By the morning of December 8th, authorities raided his hiding place and arrested Sifu before he had any chance to react. As he was handcuffed and taken back to the station, Sifu looked exhausted and dazed, perhaps realizing that his crime could not be hidden or denied. For an item worth a few $100s, the killer blindly murdered his own family member. The case left anyone who heard about it shuddering at his coldness and brutality. Many people wondered whether Sifu suffered from mental illness when he committed such a senseless act, or whether it simply stemmed from greed combined with a thug-like nature. Whatever the deeper reason, the case exposed a twisted personality, one willing to betray family ties to satisfy selfish desires. On August 1st, 2016, at the King County Superior Court, Sifu suddenly changed his plea and formally pleaded guilty to avoid a lengthy trial. He admitted to first-degree murder with the aggravating factor of using a firearm and accepted the recommended sentencing range of 26 to 33 years in prison. This decision to plead guilty was believed to have come after he and his attorney realized there was no longer any room to deny the overwhelming evidence collected by police, and they also hoped to receive some measure of leniency under the law. The sentencing hearing was held on September 16, 2016, presided over by Judge John Chun. In the courtroom, the atmosphere seemed to fall silent under the crushing grief of the victim's family. Christy's father spoke through tears, saying he had only one daughter, and now she was no longer in this world. He shared that he missed his daughter unbearably, and that the aching longing had broken him to the point that he could no longer work or live normally since that fateful day. His heartfelt words left the courtroom still. Many people present could not hold back their tears. Across from him, Sifu kept his head bowed, his hands clasped together. When allowed to speak one last time, he choked out an apology to the victim's family and admitted what he did was wrong, saying that now he, too, had lost his entire family after what happened. Christy's father sat there shaking his head as if the pain and anger inside him were far too great to forgive the killer sitting before him. After hearing statements from both the victim's family and the defendant, Judge John Chun remarked that this was a murder with a senseless motive, one that was profoundly shocking. He expressed his deepest condolences to Christy's family and said he regretted that the legal system could not do more to ease their suffering. The court then accepted the plea agreement, and Sifu was sentenced to 28 years in prison, within the recommended range, with the maximum reaching roughly 33 years. Judge Chun stated that the sentence reflected an agreement between prosecutors and defense counsel, taking into account that the defendant had voluntarily pleaded guilty and expressed remorse. Immediately after the sentence was imposed, Sifu was escorted back to jail to begin a long life behind bars. The trial ended, but the aftershock of the case remained in the hearts of those left behind. Christy's family quietly held her portrait as they left the courthouse with eyes full of loss, because even though the killer had been punished, the pain was still an emptiness nothing could ever fill. Many people who attended the hearing also could not hold back tears at such a devastating family tragedy. The case of Sifu killing his niece was a painful warning about domestic violence and blind greed. Over a new pair of shoes, a trivial material thing, an uncle ruthlessly murdered his own niece, completely shattering a family's happiness. Greed clouded his judgment, driving him to disregard basic morality and commit an act of cruelty. Within the Seattle community, the case sparked immense shock and outrage. Many people could not understand how a man could kill his own niece over such a small amount of money. At Christy's school, her friends and teachers held a deeply moving memorial to say goodbye to her. The tragedy of Christy Huynh reminds us that children's safety can sometimes be threatened by the very people closest to them. Families and society need to pay closer attention to unusual psychological signs in family members and should not be complacent about conflicts that seem minor on the surface. From a legal and public policy standpoint, the fact that Sifu still had access to and used a gun despite a firearms prohibition sparked intense debate about the effectiveness of weapons control enforcement. In theory, a gun ban is meant to prevent reoffending and protect the community from individuals with a history of violence. But in reality, this case exposed a disturbing gap. The law may revoke the right to possess firearms, yet still lacks sufficient mechanisms to ensure that a prohibited person cannot access weapons at all. That raises questions about the responsibility of authorities after a court ruling, how thoroughly firearms are checked for and recovered, as well as the duty of those around the person to manage guns and ammunition within the household. When these steps are neglected, a prohibition becomes little more than a formality, and the consequence is that one individual who disregards the law can cause an irreversible tragedy. As of now, the offender, Sifu, is still serving his sentence in a Washington state prison. According to correctional records, he will not be eligible for release until at least the year 2032. That long stretch of time is the price he must pay for his horrific crime. Yet for Christie's family, whether the sentence is 28 years or even more, nothing can ever bring the girl back. On the evening of January 7th, 2008, in Bayou La Batre, Alabama, United States, a young Vietnamese couple rushed to the local police station to report that their 4 young children were missing. The anxious man told officers that earlier that morning, he had entrusted the children to a woman he knew named Kim to look after them, but by nightfall, the children had still not returned home. This unusual report immediately drew the attention of the police, as the simultaneous disappearance of 4 children, including 1 boy and 3 girls, was unprecedented in this quiet rural area. Investigators quickly launched a large-scale search and issued an Amber Alert across the entire region. Throughout that night and into the following morning, the news spread rapidly, leaving the entire town in shock. Residents focused their attention on the Dauphin Island Bridge, the only sea-crossing bridge connecting the mainland to Dauphin Island, considered the main exit route out of the town. According to information obtained by the police, the mysterious babysitter had taken the children in the direction of this bridge before disappearing without a trace. But the case did not truly unravel until the early morning a few days later, when a duck hunter passing through the marshland beneath the bridge discovered the body of a baby drifting about 5 miles west of the bridge, around 8 kilometers. Terrified, he reported it to the police. Sirens immediately shattered the quiet morning as rescue units rushed to the marsh near the mouth of the bay, carrying a growing certainty that the worst may have happened. When the first investigators reached the scene, the sight before them left them frozen. A baby lying amid waterlogged reeds, pale skin under the early morning mist. No one dared to confirm the victim's identity at that moment, but seasoned detectives' instincts told them this could be one of the 4 missing children they were searching for. The small body showed no signs of injury from a sharp object, but severe trauma consistent with a high-impact collision, along with signs of drowning, was documented. That possibility sent a chill through the investigators. Could the child have fallen from a great height into the water? Looking upward, the Dauphin Island Bridge still stood towering as it connected the 2 shores, and they blurted out, could this be where the crime happened? Though the evidence was incomplete at the time, those instincts were soon proven true. Immediately afterward, a criminal investigation was launched. Professional divers, rescue boats, and helicopters were mobilized to the fullest extent. Canine units were also brought in to track any lingering scent traces of the unfortunate children along the bridge. However, strong sea winds and heavy traffic quickly erased most visible physical evidence. Beneath the cold, gray-blue surface, the search teams faced countless obstacles. The powerful currents near the mouth of Mobile Bay swept floating objects far from the original scene. After several hours of sonar scanning, the rescue team detected suspicious signals, but the currents were so strong that divers could not approach them right away. Not until the afternoon was the second body found, several kilometers west of the first location. It was a boy around 3 years old. The scene grew more heartbreaking as other small bodies were recovered one by one from the icy water. Preliminary examination results indicated the children died from extremely severe impact trauma upon hitting the water, accompanied by drowning. These findings strengthened the theory that the children were thrown from a relatively great height while still alive. In addition, there were no signs of struggle or restraints on the children's bodies, suggesting the perpetrator may have been someone they knew and trusted rather than a violent abduction by a stranger. Watching the tiny bodies brought ashore, investigators could not help but feel a deep bitterness as they pictured the moment the innocent children fell from a height of about 25 meters from the bridge, enduring a split second of terror in midair before striking the water. For that reason, the atmosphere at the scene was suffocatingly heavy. Many rescue workers could not hold back their tears as they personally brought each innocent body ashore. Soon after, the victim's family was asked to come assist with identification. The mother of the 4 missing children, Phang Kieu, 23 years old, nearly collapsed when she was shown pieces of children's clothing that the rescue team had just recovered. They matched perfectly with what her children had been wearing when they left home. However, to be certain, the police still proceeded with careful DNA testing. 2 days later, on January 23, 2008, the results came back, confirming that the 4 children found in the marsh were baby Danny Leung, 4 months old, baby Lindsay Leung, 1 year old, baby Hannah Leung, 2 years old, and the oldest, Ryan Phan, 3 years old. The worst fear had become reality. All 4 of Kieu's children had died in terror, extinguishing the family's last fragile hope. Once the victims' identities were confirmed, the next question became even more painful. Who harmed these children? At this point, the case shifted fully from search and rescue to a criminal investigation. According to the initial statement of the children's father, Lum Leung, it was a woman named Kim who had agreed to babysit. But who was Kim? In fact, by then, investigators already had an answer in mind thanks to a clue that surfaced by sheer chance when the report first came in. When they heard the father report the children missing, officers were uneasy because, in similar cases, statistics showed that family members, parents, or relatives were often directly involved. On top of that, Lum Leung's account was both coherent and suspiciously vague. He could not provide any additional details about the babysitter named Kim, yet he still claimed he had dared to leave 4 children in her care. That was not normal. Growing suspicious, the police quietly separated the father and the mother and took their statements repeatedly. Kieu, the children's mother, devastated and mentally shattered, insisted that she did not know anyone named Kim well enough to trust with her children, and that she had never asked her husband to take the children to leave them with someone else that day. This detail immediately raised a grave suspicion. Had Lum Leung been lying from the very beginning? Investigators quickly switched to a psychological strategy. They pretended to temporarily accept the father's story while secretly mobilizing resources to track down the woman named Kim he mentioned. But of course, no Kim ever surfaced. In contrast, neighbors and nearby witnesses all confirmed that they had never seen any unfamiliar woman come to pick up the children or babysit for this couple. The contradictions in Lum Leung's statements therefore became increasingly obvious. By the afternoon of January 8th, in the interrogation room, after hours of relentless questioning in a tense atmosphere, Lum Leung lowered his head onto the table and suddenly broke down in tears. He confessed that he himself had thrown his children into the sea. The coldness of that confession left the officers present in stunned disbelief. Recalling that moment, the chief of police of Bayou Le Batre, John Joyner, said the entire room fell silent for several seconds in shock. He described the feeling as nauseating because no one could believe a father could commit something so horrific. Even so, after the children were recovered, the police still followed every required investigative procedure to ensure they neither missed the real perpetrator nor wrongfully accused an innocent person. Traffic camera data around the area on the day of the crime did not capture any vehicle or the appearance of any unfamiliar woman transporting the 4 children. More importantly, one driver stated that around midday on January 7th, while driving across the Dauphin Island Bridge, he saw an Asian man standing on the bridge with several small children, and nearby there was a car parked. Just a few minutes later, another witness saw the same man drive off the bridge alone, with no children left in the vehicle. This information sent a chill down investigators' spines because it aligned in a terrifying way with the theory they were pursuing. And during identification, that Asian man turned out to be none other than Lum Leung, 37 years old, the victim's father, and the same person who had gone to the police station to report the disappearance. From that point on, the case's biggest mystery was unraveled. The man who had appeared as a grieving father searching for his children was now revealed as the #1 suspect in the eyes of the police. Immediately, the entire investigation pivoted to Lum Leung, his timeline on the day of the crime, his family life, his psychological state, and possible underlying motives. Scattered pieces that had seemed unrelated gradually clicked into place, forming a chilling overall picture, one that exposed the father's dark and ruthless nature. Lum Leung was born in 1970 in Vietnam. He was biracial, with a Vietnamese mother and an African-American father who was a former U.S. serviceman. In 1984, at the age of 14, Leung immigrated to the United States with his family. They chose Alabama as their home, and the whole family soon blended into the rhythm of life within the Vietnamese community along the coast. As an adult, Lum Leung worked as a shrimp fisherman, a physically demanding job, but a common one in Bayou La Batre. In terms of legal status, Leung never became a U.S. citizen despite having lived there since childhood. He still spoke Vietnamese more fluently than English, and his education level and cognitive capacity were limited. There were even signs of severe mental illness. However, it is likely these impairments were not recognized or treated early by his family, leading to serious behavioral instability later on. In his personal life, Lum Leung lived as husband and wife with Phan Nguc Q, 23 years old, without registering a marriage. The two lived modestly in the shared home of Q's parents. They had 3 children together, Hannah Leung, Lindsay Leung, and Danny Leung. Ryan Phan, 3 years old, was Q's child from her previous marriage. At first, family life was relatively peaceful. Lum Leung seemed very attached to the children and was loving and attentive even to Ryan, the only child who was not biologically his. Neighbors said they often saw him returning from the sea and gathering the little ones into his arms, appearing deeply devoted. But things gradually became unstable after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The historic storm devastated the fishing villages, forcing Leung to take his wife and children to Hinesville, Georgia to seek refuge. There, he fell into illegal drugs, began using crack cocaine, and had been arrested multiple times for drug possession in 1997, 2000, and 2007. Records also show that shortly before the crime, Lum Leung was facing prosecution in a drug possession case in Georgia, but fled back to Alabama. After returning to Bayou La Batre, he became unemployed, depressed, and sank deeper into drug use. Even more, during this period, he became involved in a romantic relationship with another woman, leaving his wife and children at home. Those factors made the atmosphere in Leung and Keel's household increasingly suffocating. The young wife repeatedly urged him to get clean and focus on making a living, but he ignored her. According to relatives, just a few weeks before the case happened, Leung began spiraling deeper into addiction, grew increasingly volatile, and showed signs of paranoia. Q's family had started considering urging her to take the children away from Leung for a while, and it is very possible that Leung himself sensed the risk that his wife and children were about to leave him. According to his initial statement after confessing, Lum Leung's motive stemmed from family conflict. He said there were fierce arguments with his wife on the night of Sunday, January 6th, and they continued into the morning of Monday, January 7th. In a state of desperation and rage, Lum Leung formed the idea of taking revenge on his wife in the cruelest way possible, destroying the very children she loved most. And when his primal violence took over, the father took each child, one by one, from the oldest to the youngest, to the Dauphin Island Bridge, and coldly let them fall into the freezing water below. That sequence matched what the scene and forensic findings indicated, and it also explained why the children died without signs of struggling or resisting. They were carried in their father's arms, placing their full trust in the person most familiar to them, only for those very hands to release them and push them into death. Investigators also believe Lum Leung's actions showed cold calculation. He deliberately made 2 separate trips to take the children to the bridge in order to avoid immediate suspicion, likely because he knew his wife would not agree if he took all 4 children at once. This detail showed that Leung was fully aware of what he was doing. Some psychological analysts later even suggested he had an especially vicious intent, taking the children one at a time so the mother, left at home, would endure 4 cycles of despair while waiting for them to return before ultimately facing the final devastating news. Even so, throughout the interrogation process, Lum Leung displayed a highly unstable mental state. After confessing, there were moments when he recanted and returned to a story that two women took the children away, while also accusing the police of coercing his statement. Leung's court-appointed defense attorney, Joe Kulikovsky, quickly stepped in and argued that his client was not proficient in English and may have confessed because he misunderstood investigators' questions. The defense requested that the court provide a Vietnamese interpreter to assist Leung, and also asked to move the trial out of Mobile County due to concerns that an impartial jury could not be found amid intense local outrage. However, the presiding judge at the time, Charles Graddick, believed Lum Leung understood English well enough and denied the request for an interpreter, while also refusing to relocate the trial. Later, many argued that this decision was made too hastily under public pressure, leading to procedural errors, and it became a major point of contention in subsequent appeals. But despite those issues, the body of evidence against Lum Leung was considered overwhelmingly clear. The prosecution file constructed an overall picture. The defendant argued with his wife, then, in a burst of fury, drove the children to the bridge and carried out the brutal act, after which he deliberately fabricated a false story to conceal what he had done. Everything indicated this was an intentional, calculated killing, not an accident or a momentary impulsive act. From a social perspective, Lum Leung was a textbook case of failed integration. Limited language ability, low education, unstable income, and then a descent into vice. Although he had received social welfare benefits, most of his money was spent on illegal drugs. Psychological burdens accumulated over the years and eventually erupted into an unforgivable crime. In a single blind morning, the 37-year-old man destroyed everything with his own hands, taking the lives of his own children and driving his own life into a dead end. At that moment, it seemed hatred and addiction had completely eclipsed the last traces of humanity in this father. In March 2009, after more than a year of evidence gathering and the completion of the indictment, the case went to a first instance trial at the Mobile County Court in Alabama. Lum Leung was charged with 5 counts of capital murder involving multiple victims and faced 2 possible sentences: the death penalty or life imprisonment without parole. However, before the trial date, the defendant unexpectedly sent a letter of guilt to the judge, expressing his desire to be sentenced to death as soon as possible in order to end everything. This action surprised both the defense attorney and the prosecutor. Some believed Lum Leung truly felt remorse and wanted to die to atone to his children, while others argued he was in despair and sought death as a way to escape the long, grinding years of prison life. Even so, under Alabama law, a case of such extreme severity was still required to go through a full trial process with a jury. Lum Leung's trial began on March 16, 2009 at the Mobile County Court in Alabama. The intensity of the case packed the courtroom journalists, curious locals, and members of the community who came to support the mother. A jury of 12, along with 4 alternates, was carefully selected, though the defense worried that the wave of public outrage in the area could affect impartiality. As expected, the prosecutor opened by calling it the most savage crime in this region's history, and urged the court to impose the death penalty. A series of evidence was presented, including the defendant's confession, testimony from witnesses on the bridge, forensic findings on the 4 children, and a police-created demonstration video simulating objects being thrown from the bridge. Each time a piece of evidence was revealed, the courtroom filled with muffled sobs. Many could not hold back tears as they heard descriptions of the injuries on the children's bodies. Throughout the trial, the defendant, Lum Leung, was almost entirely silent, his head bowed. At times, he covered his ears as if he could not bear to hear the horrific details of what he himself had done. When it came to the defense, the attorneys did not deny that Lum Leung committed the act, because their own client had admitted guilt. Their only strategy was to persuade the jury to reduce the charge from intentional murder to unintentional homicide. The defense argued that the defendant committed the crime while intoxicated on illegal drugs, losing control of his behavior and not fully understanding the consequences. The attorney also emphasized that Lum Leung had limited intellectual capacity and language difficulties in an effort to evoke sympathy. However, the prosecution strongly pushed back, emphasizing clear premeditation. The defendant made 2 separate trips to take the children to the bridge, meaning he had ample time to stop but still carried the act through to the end. The prosecutor maintained that this was an intentional crime, not an accident. That argument appeared to persuade the jurors. After 3 days of trial on March 19, 2009, the jury took only 45 minutes to deliberate before returning a verdict. Lum Leung was guilty of first-degree murder on all 5 counts, including the 4 victims and the aggravating circumstance of harming multiple people. When the court found him guilty, Leung showed no surprise and offered no further defense. It seemed the defendant himself had already prepared for the harshest sentence. On March 20th, the trial moved into the sentencing phase. After deliberation, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. Facing that fateful moment, Lum Leung looked up for the first time at his wife sitting below. Kyo sat beside her relatives, her face hollowed out by grief. At that point, Leung broke down crying and apologized to his wife. Immediately, the children's uncle, speaking on behalf of the family, loudly cut him off, stating that the family would not accept the apology because nothing could ever bring the children back. The courtroom fell silent, leaving only the sobbing of the young mother. Judge Charles Graddick read the sentence in a stern voice. He said it was the most heartbreaking case in Mobile County history that he had ever witnessed. Lum Leung would be executed by lethal injection, and under Alabama law, death row inmates typically wait an average of about 11 years before execution. The judge also issued an unusual order, instructing prison officials to hang pictures of the defendant's 4 children in his cell, so that Leung would be forced to confront his guilt every day. He emphasized that the victims were still alive when they fell into the water from a height of about 25 meters, and that the community wanted punishment proportionate to what he had done. In addition, the court cited the Son of Sam law, under which any profits, if any arising from books, newspapers, or films related to this crime, would have to be transferred to Keel, the victim's mother, up to a maximum of 50 million USD, in order to prevent the defendant from profiting from his wrongdoing. When the sentence was announced, some spectators applauded, believing justice had been served. In the row reserved for the victim's family, the mother of the 4 children quietly bowed her head. The death sentence seemed like a fitting end for Lum Leung's sins, but it also meant she was losing her husband, the man who had once been her support, and the father of her children. Tragedy piled upon tragedy. Perhaps overwhelmed, Kyo did not speak in court. Later, relatives said she agreed with the sentence and only wanted everything to end soon so she could continue living, because prolonging the process would only make the pain more enduring. However, the case's legal journey did not end there. Lum Leung's attorneys continued to file appeals to the Alabama appellate courts, arguing that the first trial contained serious errors, including the failure to provide an appropriate interpreter and the risk that the jury's decision had been influenced by intense media coverage and local public outrage. In 2013, the state appellate court unexpectedly accepted this argument, overturned the previous judgment, and ordered a new trial. However, just 1 year later, the Alabama Supreme Court reversed that decision and chose to uphold the death sentence for Lum Leung. But a real turning point came when the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, took on his appeal. Experts brought in by the organization conducted a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation and found that Lum Leung had severe intellectual disability, with an IQ of only around 51 to 60, along with a history of serious mental disorders that had never been properly diagnosed or treated. Under the United States Supreme Court precedent, Atkins vs. Playster, Virginia in 2002, people with intellectual disability cannot be sentenced to death because doing so violates the 8th Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Legally, that meant Lum Leung fell into the category of individuals excluded from the death penalty. In October 2018, after 9 years of litigation and prolonged legal procedures, the Mobile County Court was required to commute Lum Leung's death sentence to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The decision immediately sparked intense controversy. Some officials in Alabama criticized this as a legal loophole, arguing that Lum Leung had been cunning enough to commit an exceptionally brutal crime to hurt his wife, and had nearly deceived the police, yet was now spared because he was not intelligent enough. On the other hand, attorneys from the American Civil Liberties Union insisted that everyone has the right to a fair trial, and that the justice system's failure to detect Lum Leung's severe mental condition from the beginning was a major lapse, caused in part by proceedings being rushed under public pressure. Despite all controversy, the final ruling was set. Lung would spend the rest of his life behind bars, forced each day to face the memory of his crime and the images of his lost children. In a sense, it could be seen as a prolonged psychological sentence, haunting and relentless, no less severe than a court-ordered execution. In another sense, immediately after the case, Alabama residents organized memorial services for the victims. Hundreds of people, including those who had never met the family, joined together to pray for the children's souls and to share the mother's grief. A local cemetery even donated burial plots to the family, free of charge. Schools in the area raised money to help the mother shoulder the heavy funeral costs. Residents also erected a permanent memorial at Maritime Park in Bayou La Batre to remember the four little angels. On the day the children were laid to rest, not only the family but the entire community came to say goodbye. A town-wide memorial service was even held that weekend. These images show that human warmth and compassion still exist, helping to ease at least a little the weight of such overwhelming pain. And you, what thoughts has this heartbreaking tragedy left with you? Do you agree with sparing Lung's life or not? On the afternoon of the 8th of December of the year 2025, an employee of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department unexpectedly received a distress message from a female colleague. In the message, the woman said she was being physically assaulted by her husband and held against her will, not allowed to leave the house. The message left the recipient in shock, and they immediately reported the situation to the victim's direct supervisor. The supervisor, also a lead in the crime scene investigations unit, took the initiative to call the subordinate's phone number to check on her. The call unfolded in a tense atmosphere. On the other end of the line, the woman's voice was trembling and broken, as if she were trying to respond while another man loudly tried to stop her. Even though she could not say much, it was enough for the supervisor to understand that she was in immediate danger. Fortunately, thanks to that crucial phone call, the victim found a way to escape the house of horrors. Not long afterward, she drove to the Crime Scene Investigations Laboratory of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. There, in a state of panic and emotional collapse, she revealed that she had endured violence inside her own home for many years. What she described immediately pushed the matter beyond an internal issue, and it was referred to the appropriate authorities for further action. Notably, the victim in this case was not an ordinary civilian, but a crime scene investigator for the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, someone who worked within law enforcement. The petite woman weighed only about 43 kilograms, had previously undergone back surgery, and had little to no ability to defend herself. Even more bitterly ironic, the person she accused was her own husband, a police officer named Philippe Din, who wore on his chest the badge long regarded as a symbol of protection and justice. When investigators from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department's Domestic Violence Unit took over the case, they conducted an injury assessment on the victim. The results showed multiple visible injuries on her body, including bruises, abrasions, and reddened patches of skin, signs consistent with recent use of force. From the very first interview, the victim turned over an entire trove of data she had secretly collected. Photographs of injuries, video evidence, and distress messages and emails, everything she had discreetly saved in case she ever needed it. Those first pieces of the puzzle sent a chill through investigators as they realized they were facing a long-term domestic abuse case with particularly severe details. Immediately after receiving the initial statement, Las Vegas police opened an urgent investigation. A special investigative team was assigned to the case, working alongside prosecutors to gather evidence. The process moved quickly but with extreme caution, because this time the suspect was an active duty police officer, someone highly familiar with procedures and potentially capable of countering the investigation if he realized he was being targeted. Investigators spent hours conducting an in-depth interview with the victim at the Family Justice Center. With support from mental health professionals, she gradually recounted the full pattern of abuse from the year 2023 through late in the year 2025. The victim also provided the identities of people who had known about the situation, such as her in-laws, individuals she had texted for help, and a few close friends who had seen injuries on her body even though she tried to keep everything hidden at the time. Police quickly contacted and interviewed these witnesses to strengthen the investigative file. During interviews, the suspect's parents admitted they knew their son had a hot temper and that they themselves had repeatedly stepped in to advise him, but nothing ever worked. They even handed over a phone containing messages from the family group chat in which the suspect's own mother referred to his behavior as abuse and desperately pleaded with him to stop. In parallel with taking statements, technicians collected electronic data and examined the victim's iCloud account, where she had secretly stored evidence files. Notably, investigators discovered signs of unauthorized access from an unknown device into that account during the same period when the victim was cooperating with police. This discovery raised suspicions that the suspect had deliberately broken into his wife's account in an attempt to delete evidence. The entire access history was later documented in an official report and added to the case file as incriminating evidence. In addition, police found a shared note between the couple on the victim's phone. The note listed bizarre rules such as no one is allowed to leave the house during an argument and any act of violence will be reported and must not be covered up. This was the written commitment the victim forced her husband to draft after one incident in which he assaulted her, and it later became a key piece of evidence showing that the suspect fully understood his wrongdoing yet continued to reoffend. With an increasingly complete body of evidence, the case file was quickly finalized for court submission. Prosecutors assessed the case as a textbook example of domestic violence due to its systematic pattern and the severity of the conduct. After only 2 days of investigation, on the evening of the 10th of December of the year 2025, an arrest warrant for Officer Philippe Denay was approved. He was taken to the Clark County Detention Center that same night, bringing the tense internal inquiry to an end and officially opening the legal proceedings phase. According to the investigation, Philippe Denay, aged 31, was a Vietnamese-American born and raised in the state of California. He graduated with a degree in criminal justice and officially joined the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department in the year 2021. With a short, stocky, solid build and a weight of about 90 kilograms, Denay held a third-degree black belt in Taekwondo and often displayed his combat skills in front of others. At work, Philippe Denay had been described as quick and decisive. In the year 2023 in particular, he was among 3 officers who directly took down an individual armed with a dangerous weapon. The incident required Denay to be placed on administrative leave for an investigation, but he later returned to duty as normal. In the eyes of his colleagues, Denay was a passionate young officer who did not hesitate to confront criminals, so no one could have imagined that behind the crisp uniform was a completely different face. In his private life, Philippe Denay married the victim late in the year 2024 after nearly 2 years of dating. Outwardly, Denay always presented himself as an affectionate husband who doted on his wife. He frequently posted happy photos of the two of them on social media and received plenty of praise from friends around them. However, according to his wife, it was all a carefully calculated performance from the very beginning, meant to build the image of a perfect husband in everyone's eyes. Records show that Philippe Denay had no prior criminal history before this case, but there were signs that he may have had personality disorder-related issues. Denay constantly tried to isolate his wife from friends and relatives, repeatedly using cruel words to smear her and destroy her self-confidence, even insisting that not even her own family truly loved her. And it did not stop there. Denay also showed cruelty toward animals. The wife recalled that on one occasion, he used force on a dog until it bled, forcing her to hurriedly give the animal away to someone else out of fear that he would eventually kill it. Although there was no official medical diagnosis, Denay's behavior suggested a pattern of extreme control, a lack of empathy, and a readiness to turn violent whenever he felt his power was being threatened. To understand this tragedy, let's rewind to the year 2022, when Philippe Denay and the victim first met and began developing feelings for each other. At the time, Denay appeared exceptionally courteous and sincere, making the victim feel as if she were the main character in a romantic love story. She had no idea that those overly sweet gestures were actually warning signs of a future abuser. By January of the year 2023, they officially began dating. Everything moved quickly, and by June of the year 2023, the couple decided to move in together. And it was from that point that the nightmare began. According to the victim, just a few weeks after moving into the shared apartment, Denay revealed an aggressive side. He repeatedly assaulted her, leaving her injured. Yet after each attack, Denay would show remorse, kneeling to beg forgiveness, even crying and blaming work pressure for losing control. He threatened to end his own life if she left, and on one occasion, he pressed a gun to his own head in front of her to psychologically intimidate her. Because she was deeply attached, the victim chose to forgive him and believed he had simply made a mistake in a moment of temporary rage. In December of the year 2024, she still decided to marry Philippe Dinh. However, after the wedding, the sweetness did not last long. Dinh quickly returned to his old ways, if anything, worse than before. He began isolating his wife by forbidding her from visiting her family, controlling her phone, and deleting her friends' contacts without permission. For a long time, the victim had to live in constant fear, a phrase that also appeared in the police investigative report. She gradually internalized a brutal rule. With just one word or action that displeased her husband, violence would strike immediately. A horrific example occurred on a night in May of the year 2024, a few months before they married. That night, Dinh was assigned to the night shift, but instead of letting his girlfriend sleep peacefully at home, he turned the house into a place of psychological torture. From afar, he used a phone app to crank the heater to the highest setting in the middle of a summer night, while repeatedly opening and closing the garage door, setting off the alarm system with deafening noise again and again. The victim panicked and begged her in-laws for help through the family group chat, but Dinh coldly treated it as entertainment. That night, the wife and her beloved dog had to endure heat close to 40 degrees Celsius and relentless noise for hours, and the next morning Dinh returned home as if nothing had happened. Throughout the period from the year 2024 to the year 2025, the violence in the victim's household continued to escalate without stopping. Philippe Dinh repeatedly used a weapon to threaten his wife whenever she showed any intention of leaving, while also confiscating her identification documents and keeping her confined inside the house. He even deliberately dragged her into blind spots with no cameras to physically assault her in order to avoid leaving recorded evidence. Alongside the physical abuse, he constantly manipulated her psychologically with insults and smear tactics, gradually destroying her self-confidence. Tormented both physically and mentally, the wife fell into depression and despair, feeling as though there was no way out. On the night of the 8th of December of the year 2025, right after their first wedding anniversary celebration, Philippe Dinh flew into a rage because he suspected his wife of texting a male colleague, and he began to attack her. Fortunately, in the chaos, the victim managed to send a distress message to a coworker before her husband seized her phone. At that critical moment, her supervisor called the house. Despite her husband's aggressive attempts to stop her, the victim risked everything to answer the call and plead for help. Realizing that authorities would soon arrive, Dinh began to panic, smashed the phone, and left the room. Seizing that precious window of opportunity, the victim ran to her car and drove straight to police headquarters, even as her husband chased after her in a frenzy. That same night, she was taken to a safe location. Philippe Dinh fled to his parents' home, but just 2 days later he was arrested, officially forced to face the legal consequences for years of inhumane behavior. On the morning of the 11th of December of the year 2025, Philippe Dinh appeared in court for the first time at the Clark County Court. The detention hearing drew significant attention from both the media and the public. In the courtroom, Dinh appeared in an orange inmate uniform, sitting beside his defense attorney, keeping his head down in silence. Across from him, the victim was also present with the prosecutor, and bruises were still visible on her face. Before the court, prosecutor Laura Rose stated that Philippe Dinh's abuse was among the most systematic and horrifying conduct she had ever seen, and she emphasized that this was a textbook example of domestic violence. She listed a total of 11 charges that Dinh was accused of, including 2 counts of second-degree false imprisonment, 1 count of domestic battery by strangulation, 1 count of battery with a deadly weapon, 1 count of assault with a deadly weapon, 3 counts of domestic coercion by threat, 1 count of misdemeanor coercion, and 2 first-offense domestic battery counts. As soon as the charges were read, the courtroom could not help but stir, because if convicted on all of those serious offenses, Dinh could face a prison sentence of several decades. The prosecution also emphasized that the current body of evidence was extremely strong and did not rely solely on the wife's testimony. She further revealed that police had collected multiple videos from security cameras, as well as text messages, and even a note written by Dinh himself outlining family taboos and forbidden behaviors in the household. This was considered clear evidence showing that the defendant acted with calculation and was fully aware that his actions were wrongful. In addition, prosecutors expressed concern that if released on bail, Din might continue to threaten the victim or attempt to destroy evidence, especially since, during the investigation, he had allegedly tried to unlawfully access his wife's account in order to delete data. For that reason, the prosecution strongly requested bail be set at $750,000, along with strict home confinement measures if the defendant were allowed to await trial out of custody. Following the prosecution's argument, defense attorney Charles Goodwin stood up to present his counter-arguments. He argued that the allegations against his client were still one-sided and based primarily on the wife's account, and he insisted that the video evidence needed to be evaluated in a fuller context rather than relying on a few isolated clips to secure a conviction. The attorney described Din as an officer of good character and solid moral standing, who had served the community for years and had never committed any legal violations. To further support this point, he presented a series of letters from Din's friends and colleagues to show that Din had long been respected and trusted by those around him. Based on these arguments, Attorney Goodwin asked the court to reduce bail to $25,000, with a promise that Din would comply with all conditions and had absolutely no intention of fleeing. After hearing both sides, the judge recessed briefly to consider the matter carefully. In the end, she decided to set bail at $150,000. This amount was 6 times higher than what the defense requested, but significantly lower than what prosecutors had sought. Along with that, the judge ordered that, if released, Philippe Din would be placed under high-level electronic monitoring and would be strictly prohibited from approaching or contacting the victim. In addition, any weapons owned by Din were required to be surrendered immediately to law enforcement. After the hearing ended, Din was escorted back to the detention center. The defense team was somewhat satisfied, because bail set at $150,000 meant that by paying just 10% through bail bond services, Din could be temporarily released while awaiting his formal trial date. As for prosecutors, although they did not get the amount they had requested, they were reassured that the strict monitoring conditions would help ensure the victim's safety. As of now, Philippe Din's case remains in the process of further investigation and prosecution. The defendant is expected to go through evidence review procedures, and may even have to appear before a grand jury before the matter is officially brought to open trial in court. If convicted on all of the serious charges listed above, Din could face a sentence of several decades in prison. On the other hand, the defense has stated that it will fight aggressively to reduce the charges, while also hinting at the possibility of a plea deal if favorable terms can be reached for their client. All developments are still ahead, and justice will inevitably be carried out. This case not only shocked public opinion in Las Vegas, but also sounded an alarm about the problem of domestic abuse, especially when the perpetrator is a police officer, someone entrusted with the responsibility of protecting the law and the public. Many people have asked how a professionally trained officer with deep knowledge of the law could treat their spouse with such brutality. Some argue this reflects a dark side of police work. Intense stress and constant exposure to crime can negatively affect an officer's mental state and personality if there is no timely intervention. Police Chief McMahill also acknowledged that the nature of the job can change a person's character, and he has been actively promoting mental health support programs for employees through the department's Wellness Bureau in order to prevent similar tragedies. However, many opposing views argue that the profession cannot be blamed entirely, because Philippe Din's actions were a violent and selfish personal choice, and he must be held legally accountable like any other citizen. As for the victim, her story has become a powerful source of inspiration for many other women in similar situations. Across forums and social media, people expressed admiration for her courage and intelligence. From quietly collecting evidence to making the decisive choice to seek help, everything reflected the image of a resilient woman who refused to surrender to her fate. Women's advocacy organizations honored her and used her case as a representative example to encourage others in similar circumstances to speak up. Clearly, the biggest lesson from this incident is that we should not stay silent, because silence only unintentionally enables abuse to continue. Seek help proactively from friends, family, or the authorities so you can escape toxic relationships. Early in the morning of the 20th of May, 2011, at the Alhambra Police Department, a small city neighboring El Monte, a young man suddenly appeared and identified himself as John Taylor Huynh. In an agitated state and showing signs of intoxication, John said that in the backyard of a house in El Monte, the remains of a woman had been buried 10 years earlier. Even more shocking, he claimed that he himself was responsible for everything. Faced with this chilling confession, police officers initially could hardly believe what they were hearing. They immediately contacted the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, the agency responsible for investigating serious crimes in the area, to report the extremely serious lead they had just received. John Huynh was quickly detained for a preliminary interview, during which he provided a specific address, a residence located in the 9400 block of Cortada Street in the city of El Monte. According to John, this was where he had lived with his mother nearly a decade earlier. After receiving all the information, police obtained an emergency search warrant and dispatched the crime scene investigation team to the indicated location later that same day. On the afternoon of the 20th of May, 2011, the small backyard of the house on Cortada Street was suddenly filled with flashing police lights and crime scene tape. The crime scene team quickly began digging at the exact location John Huynh had indicated. At around 3:15 in the afternoon, after several hours of digging through the hard soil, forensic personnel were stunned to discover human remains carefully wrapped in an old bedsheet, buried under a relatively shallow layer of dirt. Just as John had stated, the body had almost completely decomposed, leaving only a skeleton along with a few rotting scraps of fabric and some remaining strands of hair. The burial spot was fairly concealed, hidden from outside view by a wooden fence and several bushes. This helped explain why, for so many years, the people living there had never noticed anything unusual. They also did not know the victim at all and had no connection to her, and they were horrified to learn that human remains had been found in their own backyard. Several important clues were collected at the scene during the search. In addition to the skeleton and the sheet wrapped around it, investigators found a few other items buried with the remains, including a pair of long pants stained with mud. That same evening, the Los Angeles County Department of Medical Examiner Coroner issued a preliminary assessment that the remains belonged to an Asian woman, estimated to be between 40 and 60 years old, who had died many years earlier. Based on John Huynh's statement, police soon believed that the victim was most likely Hong Tu-Fung, John's biological mother. Even so, full forensic procedures still had to be carried out. Bone samples were sent for DNA testing and compared with dental records to confirm the identity with certainty. After examination and comparison, police officially confirmed that the remains were those of Hong Tu-Fung, 57 years old, a Vietnamese woman. Immediately after identifying the victim, authorities launched a broad investigation. Even though the suspect had been identified and had made an initial confession, police still needed to collect complete forensic evidence and witness statements to strengthen the case for prosecution. The scene was strictly secured for many days, allowing forensic specialists to search for any remaining traces. Investigators worked meticulously, collecting every bone fragment and piece of fabric, and carefully sifting the soil around the burial pit to look for any physical evidence that might be connected, such as a sharp object, marks preserved in the ground, or the victim's personal belongings. However, the nearly 10-year span meant that most traces had decomposed or been lost. As a result, the scene examination mainly served to help determine how Mrs. Fung had died. Bone analysis showed multiple injuries consistent with a sharp object, aligning with John's statement that he had attacked his mother with a knife. In parallel with the scene examination, John Taylor Huynh continued to undergo detailed questioning at the detention facility. At first, he appeared cooperative, willing to recount what happened, and even personally led investigators to the exact burial location in the backyard of the house. John said the incident happened sometime in 2001, when he was around 17 to 18 years old and living with his mother in the apartment mentioned above. John stated that after attacking her, he buried his mother's body and left the home about a week later. He also admitted that for nearly the next 10 years, he deceived the people around him with various fabricated stories about his mother's whereabouts. For prosecutors, the key issue at this point was determining the specific charge and the motive behind it. Was this an act planned in advance, or something that happened in a moment of uncontrolled mental state? To clarify that, investigators needed to closely analyze John Huynh's psychology and behavior before, during, and after the incident. Alongside reconstructing the events, investigators focused on gathering statements from relatives and friends of the mother and son in order to better understand their family relationship. Many witnesses later said John had claimed that his mother died of cancer, or that she had returned to Vietnam to reunite with family. Clearly, these were intentional, fabricated stories, showing that John consciously concealed the crime for a very long time. This detail became an important basis for prosecutors to argue that John's actions were not merely an impulsive outburst, but involved calculation and a deliberate effort to evade responsibility. During the investigation, police also considered whether John Huynh had psychological issues that affected his behavior. Evaluation results indicated signs of depression and that he had frequently abused alcohol. Notably, in 2013, a psychiatrist diagnosed John with schizophrenia, and this condition was believed to possibly have existed even earlier. In March of 2014, John Taylor Huynh was charged with a first-degree offense related to the unlawful taking of another person's life, with an aggravating factor for using a weapon, a knife. Although the defendant had made admissions, prosecutors still chose to bring the case to a public trial at the Los Angeles County Superior Court so that a jury could review the evidence and deliver a verdict based on objective facts. So what could have driven a son to kill his own biological mother? To answer that question, let's look back at John Taylor Huynh's background and life in the years before the incident occurred. John Taylor Huynh was born around 1983 to 1984, and he was the only son of Huynh Tu Phuong. He belonged to the second generation of Vietnamese Americans and grew up in the state of California. Before the case was uncovered, John appeared to society as an ordinary young man, no criminal record, no involvement with gangs or common vices. However, beneath that surface were deep inner conflicts, shaped in part by his mother's strict upbringing and by psychological instability during his formative years. After leaving the old home in 2002, John moved to live in Rosemead, a city neighboring El Monte. For nearly 9 years, from 2002 to 2011, he lived a rather withdrawn life and had little social contact. John was believed to have worked various jobs to make a living because after turning 18, he almost no longer received any support from his mother. From the statements, it appeared that John had endured his mother's tight control and prolonged criticism for a long time, causing his emotions to become increasingly suppressed. When everything reached a breaking point, he unleashed all of his resentment on the very person who gave him life in the most extreme way. On a stifling evening, believed to have been sometime around June or July of 2001, a fierce argument broke out between John and his mother. With anger that had been building for a long time, John quickly lost control. According to his later statement, he ran into the kitchen area, grabbed a sharp object, and rushed to attack his mother. The conflict ended within just a few minutes, but it left irreversible consequences. Huynh Tu Phuong died right there in her own home, at the hands of her biological son. Afterward, John fell into a state of extreme panic. He dragged his mother's body onto the bed and locked the bedroom tightly. For the next 3 days, John left his mother's body there, living in fear, torment, and the increasingly heavy stench of death. Facing the risk of being discovered, his mindset gradually shifted from panic to calculation. Instead of turning to the authorities, he began thinking of ways to hide everything that had happened. On the third day, John decided to bury his mother in the backyard of the house. Because he was unable to dig a hole by himself, he hired a man who worked at a nearby parking lot to help. When the hole was finished, John paid him and saw him off, then wrapped his mother's body in a bedsheet soaked with blood, dragged it into the backyard, and quietly placed it into the shallow grave late at night. John then returned to the house and began erasing any remaining traces. He thoroughly cleaned the floor, walls, and related areas, and disposed of items that had been used during the killing. Within about a week, the inside of the apartment had been cleaned almost perfectly. A short time later, John terminated the lease and left El Monte, leaving behind an apartment that appeared completely normal, while beneath the backyard soil lay a horrifying secret. For nearly the next 10 years, John Huynh lived in Rosemead and other nearby areas, carrying that heavy secret for years. Whenever anyone asked about his mother, he would invent different stories, sometimes saying she had died from illness, other times claiming she had returned to Vietnam to live. By 2011, when he was nearly 28 years old, the burden of guilt inside John Huynh seemed to become unbearable. He grew increasingly depressed and worn down, and began to think of confessing as the only way to end his life of haunting torment. On the morning of the 20th of May, 2011, after drinking alcohol to work up the courage, John walked into the Alhambra Police Department and admitted that he had killed his mother nearly 10 years earlier. When asked why he was only coming forward now, John broke down in tears and said he could no longer live with the guilt and torment that had lasted for so many years. The moment John Huynh was placed in handcuffs, brought an end to a family tragedy that had unfolded in silence for an entire decade. After the investigation was completed, the case involving John Taylor Huynh went to a public trial at the Los Angeles County Superior Court in March of 2014. At trial, prosecutors charged John Huynh with first-degree murder, with an aggravating factor for using a dangerous weapon. Under California law, the recommended sentencing range was from 26 years in prison to life imprisonment. John Huynh's defense did not deny that their client had committed the act. Instead, their strategy was to seek a reduced charge, persuading the jury that this was not a premeditated killing, but an incident that occurred during a psychological outburst. In addition, defense counsel told the court that John Huynh was later diagnosed with schizophrenia, a disorder that can severely affect a person's ability to control behavior and perceive reality. Although John had not been formally diagnosed in 2001, the defense argued that the condition may have existed earlier, quietly influencing his thoughts and emotions. On that basis, they asked the court to consider reducing the charge to a lesser degree, or to view the act as one that caused severe consequences beyond his intent. However, the prosecution pushed back forcefully. They argued that even if John had mental health issues, the way he handled matters afterward showed a troubling level of awareness and calculation. Prosecutors pointed out that after the killing, the defendant did not call for help or turn himself in right away. Instead, he buried the body, erased evidence at the scene, then left and started a different life. Prosecutors also noted that John repeatedly lied to people around him to conceal the truth, showing that he fully understood the wrongful nature of what he had done. Even more notably, records indicated that when he first came forward, John admitted he saw his mother as a burden and that her death made him feel relieved. According to the prosecution, this detail reflected a personal and selfish motive in which the defendant deliberately removed a mother he believed was holding him back in life. After several days of trial, with extensive evidence and arguments from both sides, on the 20th of March, 2014, the court found John Taylor Huynh, then 30 years old, guilty of first-degree murder. The jury also unanimously found the aggravating factor that the defendant had used a knife during the crime. On the 14th of August 2014, a judge at the Pomona Superior Court sentenced John Taylor Huynh to life imprisonment. This was the maximum penalty permitted by law for this offense, and John would be required to serve at least 26 years before becoming eligible to apply for clemency or parole consideration. After the verdict, John made no statement. In court, he only kept his head down in silence, occasionally giving a slight nod as if accepting the punishment imposed by the law. After the trial, the defense maintained that John suffered from serious psychological issues and should have been considered with greater leniency. On his behalf, his attorney filed an appeal with the California Court of Appeal. However, in February of 2016, California's Court of Appeal, Second Appellate District, with a panel of 3 judges, denied the appeal and upheld both the conviction and the sentence for John Huynh. The appellate panel affirmed that the evidence in the case was clear and persuasive enough to conclude that the defendant committed first-degree murder. In April of 2016, the Supreme Court of California declined to review John Huyhn's case, officially ending any further efforts to appeal. From that point on, John Taylor Huynh formally began paying the price for his actions in the past. As of now, John has served more than 11 years of his sentence and remains behind bars undergoing rehabilitation. If he meets the required conditions during his incarceration, he may be eligible to apply for clemency as early as around 2037. However, whether such a request would be granted depends on many other factors, and John likely understands that the weight of guilt he carries may be even heavier than the prison walls that confine him. The case of John Taylor Huynh sent strong shockwaves through the Vietnamese community in Orange County and the greater Los Angeles area, and it drew significant attention from American media at the time. The story of a son killing his own biological mother and then quietly burying her within the grounds of their home sounded like something from fiction, yet it was a real tragedy that happened in everyday life. Local media, from the Los Angeles Times to television stations such as CBS and ABC, widely reported on the trial and the harsh sentence given to John. The case left many people shaken. On the Los Angeles Times homicide report, one reader commented that if someone could kill his own mother, then that person could be dangerous to anyone else. The case shook many people's belief in the safety of the family home, a place considered a loving shelter, yet one that can sometimes hide unpredictable undercurrents. For the Vietnamese community, the case involving John Huynh was a rare and deeply painful tragedy. Vietnamese culture has long emphasized filial piety, with values such as gratitude to one's parents deeply ingrained in every child's mind. For that reason, when news spread that a Vietnamese-American young man in the United States had killed his own mother, many people were stunned, outraged, and found it hard to accept. However, alongside the wave of outrage, there were also voices expressing some sympathy for Mrs. Phung's situation as a single parent, as well as for John's mental condition. Some believe this tragedy stemmed from a generational gap and the pressures of immigrant life, when a mother with traditional Asian values had to raise a child who grew up in a very different Western cultural environment. In a context lacking understanding and dialogue, simmering conflicts can easily accumulate over time. Even so, few could have imagined that a family conflict could push everything that far. This case also sounded an alarm about mental health awareness within the community. If John Huynh truly had schizophrenia long before, then it is deeply unfortunate that the family did not recognize it and intervene in time. John's attorney once emphasized that he was only diagnosed with this condition in 2013 after he had already been taken into custody. That detail suggests John's unusual behaviors in the years prior may have been overlooked or misunderstood. From this case, the lesson is not only for one family, but for society as a whole. Paying proper attention to mental health, especially in teenagers and young adults, by watching for signs such as prolonged depression, paranoia, or sudden personality changes can help with early detection and timely intervention, potentially preventing heartbreaking consequences later on. On Tuesday morning, December 30th, 2025, Dr. Firsting Morning, Spencer Tepe, a 37-year-old dentist, did not show up at his clinic as usual, something extremely unusual for a man known for being punctual and responsible. The clinic owner, Dr. Mark Valrose, grew deeply worried when he also couldn't reach Spencer or his wife to check on them. Fearing the worst, Valrose called the police and requested a welfare check at their home at around 9:03 a.m. At around 9:22 a.m., an officer was dispatched to the Tepe couple's house on N4th Street. He rang the doorbell, but no one answered. The door remained tightly shut. After 10 a.m., police received another call, this time from one of Spencer's friends. Suspecting something was wrong, the friend drove to the house himself to check. After knocking repeatedly with no response, he leaned in to look through a window. Instantly, his heart clenched when he caught a glimpse of a motionless body collapsed on the floor, surrounded by dark red blood. At the same time, piercing cries rang out, sounding like children crying. Panicked, he immediately called 911 to report the emergency. At 10:10 a.m., Columbus police quickly deployed units to the scene. They forced their way into the silent house. What they found inside left everyone there stunned. On the second floor, Spencer Tepe's body lay slumped near the bed, with multiple gunshot wounds and blood spattered around. Not far away was the body of his wife, Monique Tepe, 39, with a gunshot wound to the chest. The blood had already dried around the wounds, indicating the incident had happened at least several hours earlier. Downstairs, their two children, a 4-year-old girl and a 1-year-old boy, were sobbing uncontrollably, but fortunately, they were physically unharmed. The close friend was in shock and collapsed when he saw that the happy family he knew had been shattered. He had hoped he arrived in time to help, but it was already too late. The only good news was that the coworkers concerned helped expose a horrific murder early and ensured the two children were rescued before they were left even longer beside their parents' bodies. The Tepe home was immediately sealed off for investigation. Using standard forensic procedures, police estimated the time of death to be between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. on December 30th, 2025, on the second floor of the house inside the couple's bedroom. It is heartbreaking to think that during that time their two small children were still fast asleep nearby, completely unaware that their parents had met a terrible fate. The Tepe house was in a residential neighborhood, yet there were no signs of forced entry. The windows and front door were intact, with no pry marks. This led police to rule out a random break-in and robbery because an intruder would almost certainly have left signs of tampering. Moreover, no firearm was found at the scene, so the possibility of a murder-suicide was also ruled out. Police quickly confirmed that this was a double homicide. But if it wasn't caused by someone within the household, then a stranger must have entered the home. So how did the killer get inside without leaving any trace and without any sign that the people in the house were forcibly restrained? These seemingly contradictory details led investigators to believe the perpetrator might have been someone the victims knew and willingly let inside, and that the killer brought the weapon and took it away after the crime. The image of a cold-blooded murderer moving through the night and vanishing without a trace fueled the Columbus police's determination to uncover the truth as quickly as possible. Investigators quickly examined the two victims' backgrounds in detail, hoping to find leads. Spencer Tepe, 37, was a well-known dentist in Columbus. He graduated from The Ohio State University and was working at Athens Dental Depot. He was respected by colleagues and patients for his warm, friendly personality. To those around him, Spencer was not only highly skilled, but also an exemplary husband and father. He was devoted to caring for his children and radiated joy whenever he talked about them. Spencer's wife, Monique Tepe, 39, was also remembered as a gentle mother, loving and patient. According to relatives, Monique was a loving, calm mother who always brought joy. After getting married, Monique focused on raising their small family and supporting her husband. She also frequently hosted gatherings at home to bring friends together, showing that the couple were sociable and open with their circle. Monique had previously gone through an unhappy first marriage. She married a man named Michael David McKee in 2011 and divorced in 2017. After escaping her previous marriage, Monique found new love with Spencer. They married in 2021 in a warm, intimate ceremony held right at the house on N 4th Street, the same home that would later become the scene of a heartbreaking homicide. Friends of the couple said that Spencer and Monique were deeply in love and always like newlyweds, even though they had been together for years and had young children. They saw each other as soulmates and built a happy family together. The result of their love was two healthy, well-behaved, and adorable children. The last images of Spencer and Monique were photos of them smiling brightly during Christmas 2025 with their family. No one could have imagined that just a few days after that warm reunion, a horrifying tragedy would strike the couple who always wore smiles. Even more painfully, when they were killed, there was only 1 month left until their 5th wedding anniversary, yet that celebration would remain unfinished forever. From everything known, Spencer and Monique seemed to have no enemies. They lived peacefully with others and had no obvious debts or conflicts. The only faint wrinkle in the file was that Monique had been married before, but that marriage had ended in 2017, and since they had no children together, there was no need for frequent contact after the divorce. Monique herself rarely mentioned her ex-husband. With Spencer, she had found a new harbor, and she seemed to have no lingering attachment to the past. These fragments of the victims' lives might appear disconnected, but placed against the backdrop of a massacre, they would gradually lead to the grim answer to one question: who could commit such a monstrous crime? As soon as the case was confirmed as a double homicide, the Columbus Police Department mobilized its best investigative resources. Veteran investigator Greg Bodker and his colleagues painstakingly processed the scene for hours, collecting every trace, no matter how small. They took blood samples and fingerprint samples, and checked for any unusual footprints or foreign dirt inside the home. The area around the house, including bushes and small hidden corners, was also thoroughly searched for fabric scraps, bullets, or anything else the killer might have left behind. However, the perpetrator appeared to be extremely careful. The scene was terrifyingly clean. There were no unknown fingerprints, and no suspicious footprints on the thin layer of snow outside. Clearly, the crime had been carefully planned. In the first hours of the investigation, neighbors in the Wineland Park area were asked whether they had heard any unusual sounds or gunshots in the early morning. Unfortunately, no one had heard anything, possibly because it happened around 2 to 3 o'clock in the morning, when most people were asleep. It was also possible the killer used a suppressor or a type of firearm, such as a revolver, that wouldn't eject shell casings or create as much noise. However, one notable lead emerged. A woman who lived just a few houses away told police that 11 days earlier, on the night of December 19th at 2:31 a.m., she had called 911 in terror after hearing loud banging on her door. The stranger seemed to be trying to force his way in, but before she could open the door, he left at 2:44 a.m. By the time officers arrived, the person was gone. Crucially, the woman's home was only about a 3-minute walk from the Tepe residence. So had the intruder gone to the wrong address, and was the Tepe home the real target? This detail was immediately added to the case file. Although investigators couldn't confirm a direct connection, it pushed them toward the theory that the killer may have been scouting the victim's neighborhood beforehand. At the same time, investigators reviewed the history of 911 calls linked to the Tepe address to see whether the family had ever called for help due to conflict or threats. They quickly found a 911 call from April 2025 made from that address, reporting a domestic dispute late at night. Did that mean Spencer and Monique had serious marital conflict? However, Rob Mislay, Monique's brother-in-law, immediately corrected that assumption, insisting that 100% the caller's voice was not Monique. Columbus police later confirmed that the April call had been made by a woman attending a party at the Tepe home who, while intoxicated, made a random call and that it had nothing to do with the homeowners. In other words, the Tepe family record was completely clean. There had been no history of domestic violence or any openly known enemies. This further supported the conclusion that the perpetrator came from outside the family, not from within. Not overlooking digital evidence, investigators began collecting security camera footage from the area. Wineland Park is a dense neighborhood, with many homes using doorbell cameras, and nearby businesses also have outdoor street-facing cameras. Police went door to door requesting video from the night of December 29th into the early hours of December 30th. Fortunately, this technology produced the first real breakthrough. From a residential security camera, police obtained a short clip showing the silhouette of a person walking in the alley behind the victim's home at a little after 2 o'clock in the morning, right around the estimated time of the murders. In the dim footage, the man appears to be wearing a dark jacket with a hood pulled up, walking slowly through light, drifting snow. His face is obscured, making identification impossible. His shadowy figure, like a ghost moving through the night, was chilling to watch. While investigators could not confirm that he was the killer, he was the only lead at that moment. Therefore, on January 6th, 2026, the Columbus Police Department released the video to the media and asked the public for help identifying the person. The clip aired on local television stations and was posted on the department's social media pages, drawing hundreds of thousands of views. Along with the video, police appealed, if anyone recognizes this person's walk or clothing or saw anything suspicious in the area that night, please contact us immediately. Tips began flooding into the investigative hotline. Meanwhile, detectives uncovered another valuable detail from the camera data. They noticed that on multiple cameras from that night, an unfamiliar vehicle appeared. This car drove past the Tepe home shortly before the crime and left not long afterward. Using image analysis techniques, police were able to identify the license plate. From there, they traced it to a name that was not unfamiliar: Michael David McKee, Monique's ex-husband. McKee had once been married to Monique, and they divorced 8 years earlier. Since the split, he had left Ohio. Records showed he was now living in Chicago, Illinois, so it was unlikely he would just happen to be near the crime scene by coincidence. The terrifying coincidence gave investigators goosebumps. Could the killer be the ex-husband? Had he been unable to let go of the past and return to commit murder? Columbus police kept this explosive discovery confidential and quietly coordinated with Illinois law enforcement to track the suspect vehicle. The car was confirmed to be traveling north. Using traffic camera networks and automated license plate readers, authorities traced its route and discovered it had driven into northern Illinois, near the Wisconsin border. Finally, on January 10th, 2026, after more than a week of tracking, a task force apprehended Michael McKee while he was with the vehicle in Rockford, Illinois, about 80 miles from Chicago. The suspected vehicle was seized for forensic examination. According to court records, detectives gathered evidence indicating that McKee was the one driving that car during the time of the murders. The swift arrest was the result of smooth coordination between Columbus Police and the Winnebago County Sheriff's Office, Illinois, which held McKee after the capture. A case that had seemed headed for a dead end suddenly came into focus. The killer was the victim's bitter, vengeful ex-husband. The revelation stunned everyone. Old friends, the Tepe's co-workers, and even McKee's neighbors in Chicago could hardly believe it. And so new questions emerged. What motive could drive this man to return and kill his ex-wife and her new husband? Police had not yet publicly provided a specific answer. So let's look back at McKee's life to see whether anything connects him to this crime. Michael David McKee, 39, was a surgeon in Chicago. He lived in a condominium building in Lincoln Park, one of the city's upscale neighborhoods. Neighbors described McKee as friendly and polite. He often joined community barbecues and showed no obvious signs of anything unusual. Up until the day of his arrest, McKee had no recorded criminal history, which only deepened the shock surrounding the allegation. McKee married Monique in 2011 when they were both in Columbus, Ohio. At the time, he may have been completing his medical residency. The marriage, which lasted 6 years, ended in divorce in 2017. The reason was never made public, but Monique's relatives said she had endured a great deal of stress in that first marriage. It is unclear whether McKee showed signs of domestic violence or any psychological disorder while they were together, but after the divorce, Monique chose to cut off all contact with her ex-husband. They had no children together, which made it even easier for Monique to build a new life without any ties to McKee. As for McKee, he left Ohio for Chicago to advance his medical career. On the surface, the split appeared peaceful, but perhaps deep down, McKee carried heavy resentment or jealousy. He lived alone and did not remarry during that period. Meanwhile, Monique found new happiness with Spencer. What's striking is that McKee never seemed to reach out to his ex-wife, nor did he show any obvious pattern of harassment for all those years. That is precisely why when Monique remarried, she never thought she needed to guard herself against this former husband. So one possibility is that McKee had been watching Monique's life from afar, through social media or mutual friends. Seeing his ex-wife build a happy family and have children so smoothly, something he did not have, could have caused smoldering jealousy or bitterness to explode in his mind. Psychologically, it's possible McKee was obsessed with the belief that Monique had betrayed and abandoned him, even though in reality, the divorce happened because neither of them was happy. In particular, the fact that Monique and Spencer were approaching their 5th wedding anniversary may have been the final straw, triggering extreme jealousy. Beyond emotional motives, another possibility investigators might consider is the perpetrator's mental state. McKee was a doctor, a profession with intense pressure, and he lived alone, so it is unknown whether he had any underlying mental illness. There have been cases of highly successful individuals with personality disorders or severe depression who, if not treated in time, can erupt into violence. This paints the portrait of a hidden predator, outwardly educated and respectable, but inwardly fueled by a quietly boiling hatred for nearly a decade. For Monique, he had once been her husband, yet he became the most dangerous enemy she never even realized she had. As for Spencer, McKee may have felt envy and resentment, viewing him as the man who stole his wife. The relationship between the killer and the victims, therefore, was a long simmering grudge of an ex-husband, one that turned into lethal fury on a fateful winter morning. After his arrest, Michael McKee was held at the Winnebago County Jail. He is currently facing 2 counts of murder under the case filed with the Columbus Municipal Court. Prosecutors may also elevate the charges to aggravated murder during prosecution because the victims were killed intentionally and there was more than one victim factors considered aggravating circumstances. If convicted with this aggravating circumstance, McKee could face a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole or even the death penalty under Ohio law. At the first hearing, the judge will consider McKee's extradition back to Ohio and whether bail is possible. However, because this is an extremely serious homicide and the suspect fled to another state, it is almost certain the court will deny bail. McKee will be transported to Columbus to await trial. At this point, McKee's only path to avoiding the harshest punishment may be to plead guilty early and show remorse in hopes of leniency. Even so, he will not escape the reality of spending many years behind bars paying for one reckless night of deadly rage. The murders of Spencer and Monique Tepe shocked the American public in the early days of 2026. In the media, it was described as a mysterious and stunning case because of the unexpected identity of the killer. But more than anything, the crime left indescribable pain for the victim's family. 2 innocent children lost both their mother and father in a single night. For now, the Tepe children have been placed in the care of their maternal aunt's family. Relatives are trying to help them feel safe, keeping them as carefree as possible before they fully face the harsh reality. Family members also said they are struggling with how to explain to the 4-year-old girl that she will never see mom and dad again, a task too painful for words. For society, this case sounded an alarm about the hidden danger of relationships that seem to have ended peacefully. Monique divorced McKee many years ago and built a new, quiet life. No open hatred, no visible conflict, yet the tragedy still came from the past. It reminds us that in family conflicts, even after separation or divorce, we still need to stay alert to the possibility of escalating violence. And if simmering resentment is not recognized and addressed in time, it can erupt at any moment. This is a major lesson for the community and for law enforcement about monitoring and providing psychological support to parties involved in high conflict divorces. At the same time, individuals, especially women and children in vulnerable groups, should strengthen their awareness of self-protection if someone close to them has shown violent or controlling tendencies. Of course, it is hard to blame Monique. She could never have imagined that after so many years, her former husband would return for revenge. Still, after this tragedy, family psychologists advise that anyone who has experienced a toxic relationship should stay connected to their community and inform loved ones about any abnormal signs such as being followed or threatened. So protective. Measures can be taken quickly, and although the suspect has been arrested, the case still leaves haunting gaps. The exact motive behind McKee's actions remains a question that awaits testimony in court. There have been rumors that McKee faced professional troubles or psychological instability before the murders, but so far these claims have not been verified. In addition, the incident of a stranger pounding on a door on December 19th has not yet been concluded to be connected to McKee or not. If it was him, then it would mean he had planned the crime early, clearly indicating premeditation. Finally, after so much pain, a memorial service for Spencer and Monique was officially held on January 11th, 2026. But it was not organized as a dark, mournful funeral. Instead, it was held as a celebration of life, because the family wanted to remember them as wonderful people who lived lives full of love, not only as victims of a tragedy. Hundreds of people attended, laid flowers, lit candles, and shared beautiful memories of the two victims. It showed that even after tragedy, compassion and solidarity can still spread, softening the loss, if only a little. In the days following Christmas in 2025, the family of Terry Huynh, a Vietnamese woman living in O'Fallon, Illinois, United States, grew increasingly worried after being unable to contact her for several days. Terry lived with her son and was known for maintaining regular contact with relatives and longtime clients. The sudden silence of a 72-year-old woman left those who knew her deeply unsettled. At approximately 1:30 p.m. on the 27th day of December 2025, a family member decided to request that the O'Fallon Police Department conduct a welfare check at her residence. At that moment, an ominous premonition had already begun to take hold. When police forced entry into the locked house, they were immediately struck by a strong smell of gas, along with the sight of a partially burned candle inside. Recognizing the danger, authorities acted swiftly to secure the scene. After shutting off the gas supply and ventilating the house, officers carefully searched the premises. They were then horrified to discover the body of Terry Huynh lying on the floor, bearing multiple signs of physical assault. Notably, pieces of plastic food wrap were scattered around the victim's head, strongly suggesting they may have been used as a tool to take her life. In addition, there was little disturbance to the belongings inside the house, and there were no signs of forced entry from the outside. These details led police to initially rule out the possibility of a burglary or a random attack. Faced with the heartbreaking scene, along with the detail of a candle placed next to stovetops with their gas valves already left open, investigators immediately concluded that the perpetrator had planned to trigger a gas explosion in order to destroy evidence and cover up the crime. However, fortunately, for some reason, that plan failed. As a result, the entire house and the victim's body remained intact, allowing investigators to collect a great deal of valuable evidence. After completing the initial examination procedures, this devastating news was quickly relayed to the victim's family. Terry's loved ones, from her children and grandchildren to friends near and far, were left in profound shock and unbearable grief upon hearing that the kind, beloved mother and grandmother they cherished had died in such a horrifying way. In the final days of the year, when the family should have been joyfully reunited, everything instead turned into a tragic nightmare. Notably, while interviewing the victim's relatives, police obtained a critical lead. Terry had been living with her 38-year-old son, David Huynh, but at the time of the incident, he had vanished without a trace. In addition, David's vehicle, which was normally kept in the garage, had also mysteriously disappeared. These unusual details immediately made him the #1 suspect in the eyes of investigators. Shortly afterward, David's identity and physical description were documented, and an urgent alert was issued to law enforcement across the region to locate the gray Toyota Tacoma pickup truck he was known to drive. What kind of person was the victim? That was the first question police needed to answer, because understanding her life, relationships, and daily routines could help them uncover crucial leads. Terry Huynh was born in 1953 and was a Vietnamese immigrant who came to the United States in the 1980s. At the age of 72, she remained highly active and was known as the owner of Magic Nails, a nail salon in the nearby city of Collinsville. For nearly 30 years in this line of work, Terry built a strong reputation and close relationships with countless clients. People often affectionately called her Tracy. To those around her, Terry was simple in her lifestyle, hardworking, and always wore a warm, gentle smile, readily willing to help others. In addition, as a devoted Buddhist, Terry frequently took part in religious activities and shared a spirit of kindness within the community. According to gathered information, Terry had 2 sons, Solomon Huynh and David Huynh. While Solomon was married and had a life of his own, David was unemployed and financially dependent on his mother. The family also included a daughter-in-law named Jessica and 2 grandsons, Delana and Sawyer. Additionally, a nephew of hers, Anthony Vaughn, who worked at a hair salon, was the person who spoke to the press about Terry's life journey. According to accounts, she was a mother who loved her children wholeheartedly and always placed family as her top priority. Even after entering her 70s, she continued working tirelessly at the nail salon every day to provide for her son, who was nearing 40, and to support the family. That devotion and immense love only deepened everyone's sorrow over her passing. Immediately after discovering Terry's body, the O'Fallon Police Department quickly coordinated with the Missouri State Highway Patrol and nearby agencies to launch a manhunt for David Huynh, the victim's missing son. Information about David's identifying features and vehicle license plate was widely circulated across surrounding counties and neighboring states. The National Crime Information Center even flagged David as armed and dangerous and requested his immediate arrest if located. At the same time, a meticulous crime scene examination at Terry's home was carried out. Authorities collected fingerprints, DNA samples, and the remaining roll of plastic food wrap found near the body for forensic testing. Marks and injuries on the victim's body were also carefully documented to be compared against later statements. Within just a few hours of the discovery, the most important lead emerged. At approximately 4:30 p.m. on the 27th day of December, 2025, Missouri Highway Patrol troopers spotted David's gray Toyota Tacoma pickup truck traveling westbound on Interstate 70 near the town of Concordia, Missouri. Police immediately activated their lights and sirens to signal the driver to pull over, but the driver suddenly accelerated and fled, triggering a tense high-speed chase on the highway. Additional law enforcement units were quickly deployed to assist in stopping the vehicle. After a breathless pursuit, officers deployed a tire deflation device near mile marker 52 on Interstate 70. After hitting the spike strip, the truck began to swerve and then completely lost control. Around mile marker 51, it veered hard onto the right shoulder and crashed into a wooded area along the roadside, leaving the front end badly crushed. Authorities immediately secured the crash site and confirmed that the driver was David Huynh. He was subdued and arrested at the scene. Although dazed from the impact, David still attempted weak resistance. Police transported him to a local hospital in Missouri to be examined and treated for his injuries. Shortly afterward, the suspect was transferred to the Lafayette County Jail in Missouri before extradition procedures were initiated to return him to Illinois to face charges related to the killing of Terry. In this way, what initially seemed like a complicated investigation saw a major breakthrough in less than a single day. News of the suspect's arrest after the failed escape quickly spread, leaving the local community stunned. Many people asked how a son could be capable of such ruthless violence against his own mother. Based on the clear chain of evidence collected, from the crime scene findings to the exposed gas explosion plot, the prosecution had sufficient grounds to move forward with criminal charges. On the 31st day of December 2025, just 4 days after the crime occurred, the Clare County State's Attorney's Office in Illinois formally charged David Huynh with homicide and concealing criminal activity. The charging document stated that David physically assaulted his mother in the facial area, then used plastic food wrap to seal her nose and mouth until she died. After the killing, he opened the gas valves on the stovetops to allow gas to fill the house and left behind a lit candle, intending to cause an explosion to burn the scene and destroy all evidence. These details were partially reconstructed from the physical scene, even though the suspect himself remained silent. Lieutenant Patrick Feldhake of the O'Fallon Police Department stated that investigators were still awaiting the forensic report to determine the final confirmed cause of death. However, all collected indicators pointed to an intentional killing. With the suspect now in custody, the on-scene investigative phase was temporarily concluded to make way for the legal proceedings. From this point on, the case file was officially transferred to the Clare County Court for handling in preparation for upcoming hearings and trial. As for David, during pretrial detention, he consistently maintained a sullen demeanor, refused to cooperate with investigators, and showed no visible signs of remorse. This further fueled public outrage. According to expert assessments, David may fall into a category of individuals who accumulate psychological frustration over a long period, which then erupts into extreme and cold-blooded behavior. The use of household items to commit the crime, along with the carefully staged gas explosion plan, suggested deliberate calculation and full awareness of his actions. To this day, David's true motive has not been clearly established. Whether it stemmed from family conflict, financial issues, or a temporary psychological breakdown, this crime has left irreparable pain for the victim's loved ones and the wider community. As of now, this case of a son killing his biological mother remains pending trial. After his arrest in Missouri, David appeared at a preliminary hearing in Lafayette County on the 15th day of January, 2026, on charges related to fleeing and traffic violations. The judge denied bail due to the severity of the case and the risk that he could flee again or pose a danger to the community. Shortly afterward, extradition procedures to return David to the state of Illinois were initiated. In the coming weeks, David is expected to be transferred into the custody of authorities in Clare County. The Clare County State's Attorney's Office stated that they will prosecute David Huynh on charges of first-degree murder and concealment of a crime. Under Illinois law, these charges carry very severe penalties, and if convicted, David could face life imprisonment without parole because the victim was over 60 years old. To date, he has continued to exercise his right to remain silent, has not entered a guilty plea, and has not made any public statement in his defense. The defense attorney may consider examining David's mental condition or seek a reduced charge by arguing that this was not a premeditated act, even though the evidence against him currently appears quite clear. Meanwhile, the prosecution will almost certainly emphasize the brutal nature of the crime, especially the fact that the defendant used sophisticated methods to destroy evidence at the scene in order to persuade the jury to impose the harshest possible sentence. The public is now eagerly awaiting a fair and firm trial as soon as possible. Many believe that with such compelling evidence, from the physical scene and forensic findings to his flight, David will have little chance of escaping legal punishment. The remaining question may simply be what sentence he will receive. Whether he shows remorse or maintains a cold, indifferent attitude until the very end will be answered in the upcoming trial. The final verdict for David Huynh will undoubtedly serve as a sharp warning to anyone who might consider causing a similarly heartbreaking tragedy. The case of David Huynh killing his biological mother, Terry Huynh, has left a shocking impact on both the local community and the Vietnamese community in the United States. In the media, updates on the case continue to appear. At the same time, social media has been filled with condolences and sympathy for the victim's fate, alongside outrage at the perpetrator's cruelty. In Collinsville, clients and friends created online memorial pages to honor Terry. Visitation and prayer services for her were also held on the 8th and 9th days of January, 2026, at Lakeview Funeral Home in Fairview Heights, drawing large crowds who came to say their final goodbyes. This case has also sounded a profound alarm about domestic violence and mental health issues in today's community. Many have argued that elderly parents living with their adult children need greater attention and protection regarding personal safety. Likewise, if children or family members show signs of psychological instability or dangerous lifestyles, relatives and society should provide support and early intervention so that simmering conflicts do not escalate into tragedy. The pain left behind after this case is a void that nothing can truly fill. A mother who sacrificed her entire life for her children ultimately had to leave forever inside her own home at the hands of the child she had once trusted and loved with all her heart. The emotional wound for those who remain, especially Solomon Huynh, will surely be immense, as he lost his beloved mother while almost losing his own younger brother as well. On social media, Solomon shared a photo of his mother along with choked, heartbroken farewell words, expressing the unbearable grief of a son facing an overwhelming family tragedy. In the end, this story raised deeply painful questions about humanity and morality. How could a son bring himself to harm his own mother? Were economic and psychological pressures what pushed the suspect to the edge of crime, or was it simply the cold nature of an individual with distorted thinking? In your opinion, what was David Huynh's true motive? Please share your theories or any additional information you may know about this case in the comments below. Also, do not forget to like and subscribe so you can continue following Vietnamese case files in future compelling cases. That concludes today's video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you again in the next episode.